The midday sun did not just shine, it punished. It bore down on the fractured earth of the valley floor, baking the clay until it split into jagged, thirsty geometric shapes. Heat waves rose in violent shimmers, distorting the rusted skeletons of dead mesquite trees that dotted the perimeter of the property. There was no wind. Not a single breath of air moved across the desolate expanse. Elias brought the heavy iron hammer down on the wooden fence post. The dull thud echoed across the basin, a solitary rhythm in a land that had forgotten time. He lifted the hammer again. The worn wooden handle was slick with his sweat darkened by years of grip and grit. He swung. The wood splintered slightly under the blunt force. He paused, leaning his weight against the post. A drop of sweat traced the deep crevices of his weathered face, cutting a clean line through the coating of pale dust on his skin before dropping into the dry soil below. His hands, thick and heavily calloused, rested on the wire. The knuckles were a roadmap of old scars, pale white lines against sun-baked leather. He wore a faded canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and etched with more faded ink and jagged marks of a past he had buried deep beneath this dirt. He reached for the tin canteen hooked to the fence wire. The water inside was warm, tasting of metal and earth, but he drank it in slow, measured swallows. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His pale gray eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the horizon. This was his kingdom. Barren, unforgiving, empty. He had paid for this isolation with blood, and he guarded it with a cold, mechanical discipline. The silence of the desert was his only companion, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the echoes of gunfire and screams that still rattled in the back of his skull. Out here, there were no orders, no crosshairs, no bodies to drag into the shadows. Only the sun, the dirt, and the barbed wire that separated his exile from the rest of humanity. He capped the canteen and hooked it back onto the metal line. He picked up the heavy iron pliers, grabbing a length of rusted wire. The sharp metal thorns bit into his thick leather gloves. He pulled the wire taut, his boots digging into the loose dirt for leverage. The muscles in his shoulders coiled. He twisted the metal around the post, binding it tight. Then he stopped. It was not a sound that halted his movement. It was a visual disruption in the pattern of his land. Elias let the pliers hang from his hand. He turned his head slowly. His gaze dropped to the ground, trailing along the base of the fence line toward the south. The earth there was uneven. He stepped away from the post, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, the walk of a man who owned the ground beneath him but trusted none of it. The heat radiated upward through the soles of his boots, baking his shins. He knelt. The dust billowed up around his knees, coating his denim trousers. He stared at the ground. A wide drag mark cut through the untouched white sand. It was uneven, erasing the delicate tracks of lizards and beetles. Someone had crawled here, or been pulled. Beside the deep furrow in the sand lay a dark, irregular stain. Elias removed his right glove, tucking it into his wide leather belt. He pressed his bare fingertips against the dark patch. The earth was still slightly damp underneath the baked crust. He brought his fingers close to his face. Deep crimson, sticky. It was not the bright, thin blood of a coyote or a rabbit. It was thick, heavy, and carried the unmistakable metallic copper scent that Elias had spent a decade trying to wash from his hands. Human blood. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the grit mix with the crimson fluid. He did not blink. His expression remained entirely unchanged, a mask of stone carved by years of violence. He looked up, tracing the drag marks with his eyes. They led away from the dirt road, slipping under the lowest strand of barbed wire and disappearing into the dense, thorny brush of the dry riverbed on his side of the property line. Someone had crossed the boundary. Someone bleeding. Elias stood up. He wiped his dirty fingers on the side of his thigh, leaving a dark streak against the denim. He looked back at his half-finished fence, then back toward the dry riverbed. The profound silence of the desert suddenly felt heavier, thick with an unspoken intrusion. He reached down to his hip, his hand brushing instinctively against the worn leather holster resting against his thigh. He unfastened the hammer loop with a flick of his thumb. He stepped over the wire and walked into the brush. The dry riverbed offered no shelter from the relentless sun. The air hung thick and stagnant between the towering walls of cracked earth, trapping the heat like an oven. Elias moved with a measured predatory grace. His heavy boots crushed brittle mesquite twigs, the dry snaps firing like miniature pistol shots in the dead quiet. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground. The drag mark wove a chaotic, desperate path through the sagebrush. It snagged on sharp thorns, leaving tiny, threadbare pieces of torn fabric fluttering weakly in the rising heat waves. He paused. A single dark drop of blood clung to the pale, waxy spine of a prickly pear cactus. He stared at it. It was drying fast, flaking at the edges under the brutal temperature. Fresh. Very fresh. He adjusted his leather hat, pulling the wide brim lower over his brow to cut the glare. The sweat stung his eyes, but he did not blink. He stepped over a fallen, rotted cottonwood branch, his right hand resting casually against the worn walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker hanging on his hip. He did not draw the weapon. He let the heavy iron weight of it anchor him to the present moment. 30 yards deeper into the brush, the terrain dipped into a shallow, shaded wash. The shadows here were harsh, slicing the landscape into jagged shards of black and white. Elias stopped his advance. He tilted his head, letting the silence settle. He listened. Past the monotonous hum of the desert cicadas, he caught a different rhythm. A ragged, shallow intake of air. A wet scraping sound. Hands clawing at loose gravel. He stepped down into the wash. The temperature dropped a fraction of a degree, trapped beneath the sprawling, overhanging roots of a dead oak tree. Huddled against the skeletal roots was a shape. Elias closed the distance. He walked slow, deliberate. His boot heels ground against the smooth river rocks. The shape flinched, shrinking back into the darkness. It was a woman. Or what was left of one. She lay twisted in the dirt, half swallowed by the heavy shadow of the oak. Her dress, perhaps once a pale blue, was now caked in dark mud-dried blood and chalky white dust. It hung in ruined shreds around her narrow shoulders. She dragged herself backward as Elias approached, her broken fingernails digging frantic, shallow trenches into the dry earth. Her legs trailed uselessly behind her dead weight, scraping over the sharp stones. One ankle swelled grotesquely over the edge of a missing shoe, the skin mottled with ugly dark purple and black bruising. She hit the massive trunk of the dead oak. She had nowhere left to crawl. Elias stopped exactly 10 feet away. He towered over her, a massive, unmoving silhouette blocking out the midday sun. The Colt remained holstered. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his thumbs hooked into his heavy leather belt. He said nothing. He simply watched her breathe. She pushed herself up on trembling, scraped palms. Her hair clung to her face in sweat-soaked strands, masking her features. She panted, her chest heaving, fighting for air in the suffocating, dusty heat. Finally, she raised her head. Her face bore the violent, undeniable signature of another man's fists. A deep laceration split her lower lip, still weeping thin lines of red. Her left eye swelled completely shut, ringed in a fresh, sickening canvas of yellow and black. The good eye, a piercing, frantic green, locked onto Elias. She stared at the gun resting on his thigh, then slowly tracked up to his scarred, impassive face. She shrank back, pressing her spine hard against the rough, unforgiving bark of the tree. Her voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence, was barely a whisper. It was shredded by thirst, dust, and exhaustion. Please. Elias did not move. The cicadas buzzed. A hawk circled high above the canyon. Please don't hurt me. She swallowed hard, coughing dryly. She gestured weakly toward her ruined legs. I can't walk. I can't. She let her head fall back against the tree trunk, her remaining strength completely spent. A single tear cut a clean, pale track through the thick grime coating her cheek. Elias studied the damage with clinical precision. The injuries were not from a simple fall from a horse. The deep, distinct bruising on her upper arms formed perfect finger marks. The split lip. The hunted, broken look in her eye. She was not a lost traveler. She was prey. He looked past her, lifting his gaze toward the eastern horizon where his dirt road vanished into the shimmering heat. Trouble was a heavy shadow, and she had dragged it right across his property line. The iron rule of his existence dictated a very simple protocol turnaround. Walk away. Let the desert reclaim its own. Let the wolves eat the weak. He had spent 10 long years washing the blood from his ledger, building this fortress of dust and isolation to keep the cruelty of the world outside his fences. He uncrossed his arms. He hooked his thumbs into his front pockets. He looked down at the ruined woman in the dirt. She squeezed her remaining eyes shut, bracing her body for a kick, a blow, or the metallic finalizing click of a revolver hammer pulling back. She curled into a tighter ball, making herself as small as possible among the roots. Elias unhooked the tin canteen from his belt. He took 2 heavy steps forward. The dry leather of his boots creaked. He unscrewed the metal cap. He knelt, his knees cracking loudly in the stillness until he was level with her bruised face. He held the canteen out. The water sloshed gently against the tin. She opened her eye. She stared at the water, then at his scarred leather, tough hand offering it. She hesitated, her breathing shallow and fast. Slowly, with a trembling, dirt-caked hand, she reached out and took the cold metal. Elias stood back up. He turned his broad back to her, facing the eastern trail. He adjusted his hat, his pale gray eyes narrowing at the empty baking horizon. He listened to her drink the desperate, greedy swallows of a dying creature. The profound silence of his kingdom was broken, and he knew with cold, heavy certainty that the men who broke it would soon follow. Elias turned his back on the woman in the shadows. He climbed the steep embankment of the dry wash, his heavy boots digging deep into the crumbling red clay. The cool shade vanished instantly. The midday sun hit him with the force of a physical blow, pressing down on his broad shoulders, burning through the thin, faded canvas of his shirt. He walked back toward the property line, his stride unbroken, maintaining a steady metronomic rhythm. He did not look back into the brush. He stopped at the wooden post. He picked up the heavy iron pliers he had dropped in the dirt. He weighed them in his calloused hand, feeling the hard metal already baking under the relentless light. He tossed them aside. They landed in the white dust with a dull thud. He stood behind the top strand of rusted barbed wire, planted his boots shoulder-width apart, and stared east. He waited. The eastern horizon blurred. A smudge of pale brown dirt rose against the stark, cloudless blue sky. Elias watched the dust column grow. It moved with a steady, mechanical purpose along the wagon rut, chewing up the miles of open basin. The ground beneath his boots began to hum. A low, vibrating tremor traveled up his legs and settled in his chest. 10 minutes passed. The rhythmic thumping of hooves bled through the air, multiplying into a chaotic, heavy drumbeat. They materialized from the dust wall like phantoms. First, the dark, jagged silhouettes cutting through the glare. Then the brutal details sharpened. 4 men, 4 horses. They rode hard, pushing the animals past their limits under the punishing heat. They hauled back on the reins 20 yards from the boundary wire. The horses fought the heavy iron bits, tossing their massive heads, their eyes rolling white with heat and exhaustion. Thick ropes of saliva flew from their dark muzzles, splattering against the parched earth. The smell hit Elias, then a sour, suffocating wave of unwashed men, wet horsehair, stale tobacco, and cheap rye whiskey. The riders arranged themselves in a loose, tactical semicircle on the public side of the dirt road. The dust settled over them, coating their clothes and gear in a dirty, pale shroud. The man in the center rode a tall, heavily scarred bay horse. He wore a gray bowler hat thick with trail grit. A silver pocket watch chain hung across his dark, sweat-stained vest. He leaned to the side and spat a thick stream of dark brown tobacco juice into the sand. He crossed his hands over the saddle horn, the leather creaking under his weight. He took his time. He looked at the barren landscape, the rusted wire, and finally at the solitary man standing behind it. "Hot day for mending fences, friend," the man said. His voice was smooth, carrying a practiced, lazy drawl that masked the tension in his posture. Elias did not nod. He did not speak. He kept his hands resting loose at his sides, inches from his thighs. The rider chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that lacked any real amusement. He shifted his weight. The bay stepped sideways, its iron shoe striking a buried flint rock. A spark flared and died instantly in the bright daylight. "Name's Vance," the rider offered. He gestured with a leather-gloved hand toward the dry wash behind Elias. "Me and my boy's been riding since before dawn, tracking a stray. Looks like she might have dragged herself right onto your dirt." The three men flanking Vance sat in heavy silence. One of them, a massive, thick-necked man with a matted beard, rested his hand openly on the stock of a Winchester rifle sitting across his lap. Another man struck a match off his saddle, cupping his hands to light a rolled cigarette. The smoke curled around his narrow, squinting eyes. Elias held Vance's stare. The air between them tasted of copper and dry earth. "I don't keep strays," Elias said. The syllables dropped like heavy stones into a dry well. Vance smiled. It did not reach his eyes. They were flat, calculating things, measuring the distance, the angles, the absolute stillness of the man in front of him. Vance reached up and slowly unbuttoned his vest, pulling the fabric aside to reveal the silver star of a deputy pinned to his suspenders. It was tarnished and scratched, but the authority it represented hung heavy in the stifling air. "Now see, that's a problem," Vance said, his tone dropping an octave, shedding the polite veneer. "This particular stray took something valuable from my employer, a considerable sum, and she belongs to him. Legally speaking." Vance pointed a thick, dirty finger at the ground. The drag marks leading under the bottom wire were carved deep into the earth, undeniable and glaring in the harsh light. "Her trail crosses your line right there, mister. I got a warrant in my saddlebag, and I got 3 deputies who are tired, thirsty, and losing their patience. We are going to collect our property." Elias looked at the drag marks. He looked at the 3 men fanning out slightly, their horses pacing restless and agitated. The man with the cigarette dropped the smoking nub into the dirt. The heavy-set man thumbed the hammer of his Winchester back with a sharp metallic click. The desert held its breath. The cicadas stopped their buzzing. Elias shifted his gaze back to Vance. He did not look at the tin badge. He did not look at the drawn rifle. He looked at the pulse beating in Vance's throat. "Private property," Elias said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heat like a blade. Vance sighed a long, exaggerated sound of disappointment. He straightened up in the saddle, taking the thick leather reins in his left hand. His right hand drifted down, hovering inches above the bone handle of his revolver. "Mister, you are standing between the law and its rightful business. I am asking you nice and easy to step aside." Elias felt the familiar cold weight settling deep in his chest, the absolute clarity of impending violence. He let his right hand hang free, his fingertips brushing the rough denim of his trousers. The sun hammered the earth. Shadows shrank to tight black pools beneath the horses' hooves. The standoff stretched, measured only by the erratic ticking of cooling saddle leather and the heavy, wet breathing of the exhausted animals. Vance kept his hand hovering over his bone-handled revolver. The tarnished silver badge on his chest caught the blinding glare. He chewed the inside of his cheek. The easy, practiced drawl had evaporated, leaving behind a hard, calculating silence. He measured the man standing across the wire. He measured the absolute stillness. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that preceded a rock slide or a lightning strike. Behind Vance, the heavy-set man with the matted beard let out a wet, guttural cough. He spat a wad of dark brown phlegm into the dry sagebrush. He shifted his massive bulk, the saddle springs whining in sharp protest. "Christ almighty, Vance!" The bearded man grunted, his voice ground like river stones. "We are roasting out here for one dirt farmer. Read him the paper or shoot him. I ain't burning my neck all afternoon." Vance did not turn his head. He kept his flat eyes locked on Elias. "Patience, Cobb, we represent the law." Cobb sneered. He swung his thick right leg over his saddle horn and dropped down. The heavy impact sent a cloud of white dust billowing around his knees. He stood a full head taller than Vance, a mountain of sweat-stained flannel and unwashed flesh. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in his left hand, the dark steel barrel pointing toward the dirt. He took a heavy step forward. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his iron-shod boots. "Law's done talking," Cobb growled. He walked past Vance's bay horse. The animal flattened its ears, stepping sideways to avoid the massive man. Cobb stopped 2 paces from the rusted barbed wire. He looked at Elias. His eyes were small, buried deep beneath a heavy sunburned brow. They held no calculation, only the dull, blunt force of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted through sheer physical mass. "You deaf old man?" Cobb asked. He wiped his mouth with the back of a hairy, dirt-caked hand. "The deputy told you to step aside. We got a piece of torn-up meat to collect, and you are standing in the way of our payday." Elias did not flinch. He did not shift his weight. He watched the sweat roll down the deep, dirt-lined creases of Cobb's neck. He watched the man's thick index finger resting casually outside the trigger guard of the Winchester. "This side of the wire," Elias said. His voice dropped an octave, scraping against the dry air like rusted iron. "Is mine." Cobb let out a low, rumbling laugh. It lacked humor. It was a challenge thick with contempt. He took another deliberate step forward. He stood right at the boundary line now. The rusted metal barbs hovered mere inches from his thick leather chaps. "Wires, rusted farmer," Cobb mocked. He leaned forward, his massive chest expanding. "Looks like it's about to snap anyway." He lifted his heavy right boot. The iron heel caught the midday sun. He brought it down hard, planting his foot squarely on the bottom strand of the barbed wire. The old, brittle wood of the fence post groaned under the sudden violent weight. The wire squealed, pulling taut, digging its iron teeth deep into the thick leather of Cobb's boot. He had crossed the line. The 3 men on horseback stiffened. The man with the narrow eyes dropped his right hand to rest fully on the butt of his sidearm. Vance leaned forward in the saddle, the muscles in his jaw bunching tight beneath his graying stubble. Elias looked at the heavy boot pressing his wire down into the white dust. He traced the line of Cobb's leg up to the massive chest and finally to the small, cruel eyes staring back at him. The air stopped moving completely. The desert held its breath. Elias let his hands hang entirely loose. The thick calluses on his thumbs brushed lightly against the worn seams of his denim trousers. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch. His pale gray eyes went completely dead, stripping away the farmer, leaving only the ghost he had spent a decade trying to bury. "Take it back." 3 words, spoken without heat, without elevation, without a trace of anger. They slipped into the sweltering air with the cold, absolute certainty of a steel blade sliding from a leather sheath. It was not a request. It was the mechanical recitation of a fact, a final offer of survival. Cobb snorted a wet, ugly sound. He shifted his weight forward, pressing harder onto the trembling wire. He began to lift his left foot to step fully onto the property. He raised the Winchester, the heavy brass receiver catching the light, bringing the barrel up toward Elias's chest. "I think I'll just walk right over it, old man." Cobb grinned, exposing a row of yellowed teeth. "And then I'm going to walk right over you." Elias did not blink. The final grain of sand fell through the glass. The perimeter was breached. The transition took less than a second. There was no warning, no shift in posture, no twitch of the jaw. Elias moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion born from a decade of surviving things far worse than the men standing before him. The heavy leather of his holster sighed. The blued steel of the Colt peacemaker cleared the rim. He did not extend his arm fully. He fired from the hip, a tight mechanical pivot of his wrist. The roar of the .45 caliber cartridge shattered the stifling desert quiet. A blinding tongue of yellow flame punched through the heavy air, followed instantly by a thick, expanding cloud of acrid white smoke. The smell of burning sulfur and crushed black powder swallowed the scent of dust and sweat. Cobb did not have time to swing his Winchester. The heavy lead slug caught him dead center in the massive chest just below the collarbone. The kinetic impact of the round halted his forward momentum completely. The air left his lungs in a wet, choked gasp. His small, cruel eyes widened, staring blankly at the sky. He dropped like a felled oak, his immense weight crashing onto the rusted barbed wire, snapping the brittle wooden post cleanly at the base. His Winchester hit the dirt, discharging a stray round harmlessly into the sagebrush with a flat crack. Chaos erupted behind the smoke. The horses screamed. Vance's scarred bay reared up on its hind legs, its hooves pawing wildly at the empty air. Vance fought the heavy leather reins, his boots slipping in the stirrups. His face contorted as he desperately tried to control the panicked beast and draw his weapon at the same time. The man who had been smoking clawed at his sidearm. He cleared leather, bringing his revolver up. Elias's thumb rode the hammer back. A sharp, precise click. He shifted his aim a fraction of an inch to the right. He squeezed the trigger a second time. The Colt roared again. The man with the cigarette jerked backward. The heavy bullet tore through his right shoulder, shattering bone and spinning him out of the saddle. He hit the unyielding earth hard, a spray of crimson mist hanging briefly in the air before the heat baked it away. His horse bolted, kicking up a blinding wall of white dust as it fled eastward. Elias cocked the hammer for a third time. He tracked the barrel toward Vance. Vance had finally wrestled his horse down, his revolver out, and leveled. But he was looking into the dark, hollow eye of Elias's Colt, staring through the thinning curtain of white smoke at a man who had not moved a single inch from his spot. Elias's pale gray eyes were entirely devoid of heat or hesitation. They offered nothing but cold arithmetic. Vance's grip faltered. He looked at Cobb's massive body tangled in the broken wire, bleeding out into the sand. He looked at his wounded deputy thrashing in the dirt, clutching his ruined shoulder. Vance spurred his horse. He hauled the reins hard to the left, spinning the animal around. He shouted a hoarse, ragged command. The wounded man scrambled to his feet, leaving his dropped gun in the dust, and grabbed the stirrup of the remaining mounted deputy. They scrambled away, a chaotic tangle of men and beasts, retreating into the shimmering heat waves swallowed by the thick dust cloud of their own making. Elias stood motionless. He watched the dust cloud recede until it was nothing more than a pale smudge on the horizon. The ringing in his ears faded, replaced by the solitary, agonizing sound of Cobb's final rattling breaths, choking on his own blood. Then silence reclaimed the basin. Elias lowered the Colt. He pressed the ejector rod, kicking two smoking blackened brass casings into the dirt. They clinked softly against the gravel. He reached into his pocket, retrieved two fresh cartridges, and slid them into the cylinder. He snapped the loading gate shut and eased the weapon back into its holster. He turned his back on the body. He walked down into the dry wash. The shadows had lengthened, offering a small dark reprieve from the punishing sun. The woman was still huddled against the dead oak roots. She had covered her ears with her dirt-caked hands, her body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She stared at Elias as he approached her one good eye, tracking the fresh cordite smoke that clung to his clothes. He stopped in front of her. He did not offer a hand. He simply bent down, sliding one thick, scarred arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. She felt like a bundle of hollow reeds and bruised skin, fragile and broken. She gasped as her ruined legs shifted, her face burying instinctively into the coarse, sweat-stained canvas of his shirt. The sharp, metallic smell of the recent violence rolled off him, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of the desert. Elias carried her out of the wash. He stepped over the broken wire, his boots crushing the splintered wood of his ruined fence. He walked past the massive, lifeless bulk of the dead man without looking down. He headed straight for the solitary structure sitting half a mile away, a square, windowless cabin built from dark, weathered timber fortified against the elements and the world. The heat beat down on his shoulders. The dust settled on the fresh blood. The first shell had been spent. The quiet was over. Elias kicked the heavy oak door shut behind him. The iron latch dropped into its cradle with a solid, finalizing clank, instantly severing the brilliant, punishing glare of the afternoon sun. The interior of the cabin offered a stark, immediate contrast to the blinding desert. It was submerged in a thick, cooling shadow, the air stagnant, but entirely devoid of the oppressive heat radiating from the clay outside. The room carried the deeply ingrained sense of roasted coffee beans, dry wood ash, and the sharp metallic tang of heavily oiled gun steel. He carried the woman across the uneven wide plank floorboards, his boots groaning softly against the wood. He laid her down on a narrow canvas cot pushed against the far wall. Dust motes danced lazily in a single sharp shaft of light, piercing through a hairline crack in the heavy wooden shutters. The moment her back touched the mattress, she pulled her knees toward her chest, curling inward. Her ragged breath caught in her throat, a harsh scraping sound in the quiet room. Elias stepped back. He unbuckled his gun belt, letting the heavy leather rig slide from his waist. He draped it over the back of a ladder-backed chair beside the cot. The Colt remained fully loaded in the holster, the walnut grip resting within immediate arm's reach. He walked to a cast-iron stove sitting in the corner. A blue enamel basin rested on top of it. He lifted a heavy clay jug from the floor and poured water into the basin, the liquid splashing loudly, breaking the heavy silence. He retrieved a folded stack of clean, threadbare cotton flour sacks and a dark amber glass bottle from a rough-hewn wooden shelf. He carried the items back to the cot and set them on a small three-legged stool. He pulled up the chair and sat down. He uncorked the amber bottle with his teeth, spitting the cork into his palm. It was raw, unaged corn whiskey. The harsh, volatile fumes immediately stung the air. He poured a generous measure onto a white cotton cloth. He reached out toward her face. She flinched violently, pressing her spine hard against the log wall. Her good eye tracked his calloused, heavily scarred hands with the frantic intensity of a cornered animal. Elias did not pull back, nor did he offer a word of comfort. He simply froze, holding the damp cloth midair, and waited. He let the seconds tick by until the erratic heaving of her chest slowed to a more manageable, shallow rhythm. Slowly, he pressed the cloth to the deep laceration above her swollen eyebrow. She hissed, her jaw clamping shut so hard the muscles in her neck corded. Her broken fingernails dug violently into the coarse canvas of the mattress. The raw alcohol burned aggressively through the layers of white dust and dried blood. Elias worked with a cold, mechanical efficiency. His movements were precise, entirely devoid of hesitation or gentleness. He had cleaned wounds exactly like these 100 times before in muddy trenches and dark blood-slicked alleyways, working on men who had begged for their mothers and men who had cursed God with their final breath. He rinsed the cloth in the blue basin. The clear water instantly clouded, turning the color of diluted rust. Elias stared at the pinkish liquid swirling against the enamel. For a fraction of a second, his hands stopped moving. The dimly lit cabin seemed to fade, replaced by the suffocating stench of a burning saloon and the phantom weight of a dying man's grip twisting his shirt collar. His jaw tightened. He blinked slowly, burying the ghost back into the shallow, unmarked grave of his mind. He wrung the cloth out, the thick muscles in his forearms bunching tight. He moved down to her ruined legs. The left ankle was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, the skin stretched tight and shining with ugly dark purple contusions. He ran his thick thumbs along the tibia, applying a steady, testing pressure. She let out a sharp, breathless whimper, her entire body going rigid against the wall. "Not broken," Elias stated. His voice was a low gravel rumble scraping the silence. They were the first words he had spoken inside the cabin. Severely sprained. Ligaments are torn. He soaked a long strip of dry cotton in the basin, wrapping it tightly around the swollen joint to bind it, securing the knot with a swift, practiced pull. She watched his hands. The brutal, instantaneous violence he had unleashed outside contrasted sharply with the steady, methodical way he bound her injuries. She swallowed hard, her dry throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "His name is Sterling," she whispered. The syllables scraped against her parched vocal cords. Elias did not look up. He wiped the dirt from her uninjured shin. "He owns the massive cattle operation on the other side of the eastern ridge." She continued, her chest rising and falling erratically. "I was a maid in the main house. 3 days ago, his wife. She found out he was beating the stable hands to death for stealing rations. She packed a bag. She threatened to ride to the marshal in the territory capital." Elias tossed the bloody rag into the basin. He leaned back in the chair, resting his forearms heavy on his thighs. He looked at her. "He didn't let her leave?" the woman choked out. A single heavy tear spilled over the bridge of her nose, tracking through the clean patch Elias had just wiped. He took a heavy silver candlestick from the dining room table. He struck her, over and over, until the floor was red, until she stopped making noise. Her hands trembled violently in her lap. She clutched the torn, filthy edges of her ruined dress, her knuckles turning white. I was standing in the hallway. I saw it. He looked up, and he saw me. Elias watched the rapid pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. The narrative was an old, familiar song: power, unchecked cruelty, and the desperate, bloody flight of the weak. "I ran," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow, exhausted rasp. "I took a leather-bound ledger from his study desk on my way out. It documents the bribes he pays the local judges and the land deeds he forged. I thought having it would keep me safe. I thought I could trade it for my life." She let out a dry, broken sob. It just made him send Vance and the trackers. She looked at the heavy gun belt draped over the chair, then back to Elias's scarred, impassive face. "They will come back," she whispered, her eye wide with absolute certainty. "Sterling won't let that ledger reach the town. He will burn this entire ridge to the ground to get it back." Elias stood up. The wooden chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. He picked up the blue enamel basin, walking to the heavy oak door. He cracked it open just enough to toss the bloody water out into the dry dirt, then shoved it shut, dropping the iron latch back into place. He walked over to a tall wooden cabinet, pulled out a long, heavy cardboard box of .45 caliber ammunition, and walked back to the table. He dropped it onto the wood. It landed with a dense, heavy thud. "Let them," Elias said. The sun died a slow, bleeding death behind the jagged western ridge. The transition was merciless. The desert shed its trapped heat with a rapid, brutal efficiency. The oven of the afternoon evaporated, replaced by a creeping, bone-deep cold that seeped through the cracks in the floorboards and settled heavy on the skin. Inside the cabin, the thick shadows stretched and merged, swallowing the corners of the room until only absolute pitch-black darkness remained. Elias did not strike a match. He did not reach for the glass chimney of the kerosene lamp resting on the shelf. Light was a target. He moved through the pitch-black room entirely by muscle memory. His heavy boots slid across the uneven wood, making barely a whisper of sound. He stopped at the heavy wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. The iron hinges groaned a dull metallic protest as he lifted the lid. He pulled out a thick, coarse wool blanket smelling faintly of mothballs and dry cedar. He walked to the cot, too. He dropped the heavy wool over the woman. She lay completely still, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her teeth chattered a rapid, involuntary clicking that cut through the quiet. She gripped the edge of the blanket, pulling it up to her bruised chin. She did not speak. She watched the dark silhouette of the man moving around her, a massive shadow against a sea of black. Elias stepped to the heavy oak table in the center of the room. He reached out his calloused fingers, finding the cold-blued steel barrel of his Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. He picked it up, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the walnut stock against his shoulder. He picked up the cardboard box of .45 caliber ammunition. He loaded the rifle in the dark. The process was a mechanical rhythm practiced thousands of times. His thick thumb pushed the brass cartridges through the side-loading gate. The heavy metal shells slid into the tubular magazine with a cold, absolute finality. He filled the tube to capacity. He gripped the iron lever, throwing it down and pulling it back up in one fluid, aggressive motion. The action chambered a heavy lead round with a sharp, heavy chunk of locking steel. He laid the rifle flat on the table. He drew the Colt Peacemaker from his leather holster. He spun the cylinder, letting the quiet, clicking whir fill the space, his thumb trailing over the exposed rims of the cartridges to ensure every chamber was full. He walked to the single front window. He pressed his broad back flat against the rough, splintered bark of the log wall. He turned his head slowly, pressing his face close to a narrow, jagged crack between the heavy wooden shutters. He breathed in the cold air seeping through the gap. It tasted of dry sage and frost. Outside, the desert had gone unnaturally still. The evening wind had completely died down. The chaotic buzzing chorus of the cicadas had ceased. Even the distant morning yips of the coyotes were absent. It was a suffocating, pressurized void. The natural inhabitants of the basin had gone to ground, sensing the heavy metallic stench of impending violence drifting across the sand. Elias waited. The slow, rhythmic thud of his own heartbeat was the only sound in his ears. 20 minutes passed in the freezing dark. Then the silence broke. It was not a loud noise. It was a subtle shift in the texture of the night. A faint, rhythmic grinding of iron shoes against packed dirt. Horses. But they were moving at a slow, deliberate walk, their riders holding them back, keeping the heavy, jangling iron bits pulled tight. The vibrations traveled through the frosted earth, climbing up the stone foundation of the cabin and registering against the soles of Elias's boots. The rumbling stopped entirely. They had halted a quarter of a mile out, just beyond the dry riverbed. Elias kept his eye fixed to the narrow crack. The moon was a pale, sharp sliver, casting a weak silver wash over the desolate yard. The rusted skeletons of the dead mesquite trees cast long, twisted black shadows across the white sand. A new sound drifted through the freezing air. The unmistakable heavy crunch of leather boots stepping onto the gravel basin. Not one pair, a dozen. They were dismounted. They were spreading out, forming a wide, tightening circle around the property. A dry twig snapped sharply near the eastern corner of the fence line. A heavy leather scabbard dragged against a thorny bush. A man coughed, the sound muffled instantly by a thick glove. A dark shape detached itself from the black mass of the brush, moving in a low, hunting crouch. Then another. They moved with the slow, deliberate caution of men who knew exactly what was waiting for them inside the dark box of timber. From the western perimeter, a sharp metallic snick pierced the cold air. The sound of a heavy revolver hammer being pulled back and locking into place. It carried across the barren yard with crystal clarity. Inside the cabin, the woman on the cot stopped breathing entirely. Elias did not shift his weight. He did not blink. He stared out into the silver-washed yard, watching the shadows multiply and creep closer to his walls. The perimeter was closed. The trap was set. The scent of cold dust mixed heavily with the sharp, acidic tang of gun oil radiating from the rifle on the table. He wrapped his thick, scarred fingers around the walnut grip of the Colt. The iron was freezing against his palm. The assault did not begin with a war cry. It began with the slow, agonizing squeal of rusted iron scraping against old wood. At the rear of the cabin, an iron pry bar wedged beneath the heavy exterior shutter of the small kitchen window. The men outside worked with a desperate, heavy-handed urgency, misjudging the thick density of the timber. Elias tracked the sound with absolute mechanical precision. He did not run. He glided across the uneven floorboards, stepping cleanly over the spots that he knew would creak. He pressed his back against the wall beside the straining window, the Colt loose in his right hand. The heavy iron bar dug deeper. The wood splintered. The rusted nails gave way with a sharp, violent snap. The shutter tore open, slamming against the exterior logs. A gust of freezing night air rushed into the stagnant cabin, carrying the metallic scent of sweat and gun oil. A sliver of pale moonlight sliced through the opening, illuminating the dancing dust motes. A dark silhouette filled the frame. A man hauled himself halfway through the window, his chest resting on the sill, a revolver gripped tightly in his extended hand as he peered into the pitch-black void of the room. Elias did not offer him the chance to adjust his eyes. He stepped directly in front of the window. He jammed the cold steel barrel of the Colt against the dark canvas of the man's vest directly over the sternum. He squeezed the trigger. The detonation was deafening within the confined walls. A massive tongue of orange flame illuminated the cabin for a fraction of a second, revealing the stark, expressionless lines of Elias's face. The kinetic force of the heavy .45 caliber round lifted the intruder clean off the windowsill, throwing him backward into the freezing yard. He hit the frozen dirt with a wet, heavy thud. He did not groan. The single shot broke the dam. Outside, the night erupted. A chaotic, blinding volley of gunfire tore into the cabin from 3 different angles. Heavy rifle slugs chewed into the thick exterior logs, sending massive splinters flying into the darkness. Lead bullets punched through the thinner wood of the front shutters, whizzing through the interior air like angry hornets. One round struck the cast-iron stove with a sharp, ringing ping, showering the floor with black sparks. Another shattered the glass chimney of the unlit lantern on the shelf. Elias dropped instantly to his stomach. The air above him filled with flying wood chips and stinging dust. He crawled across the floorboard, sliding his body beneath the heavy oak table. He glanced toward the cot. The thick wool blanket remained completely motionless. The gunfire from the yard slowed, then ceased entirely. The men were reloading. The ringing in Elias's ears faded into a high-pitched whine. The air inside the cabin grew thick and suffocating, choking on the acrid, sulphurous cloud of burned black powder. It stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. Heavy, frantic boot steps pounded against the wooden planks of the front porch. The timbers groaned under a massive, concentrated weight. They were bringing something heavy. A crushing impact rocked the front wall. Dust rained down from the ceiling joists. The thick oak door shuddered violently on its iron hinges, but the heavy interior crossbar held. They were using a fence post as a battering ram. Elias slid out from under the table. He pulled the Winchester 1873 toward him. He rose to one knee, resting his left elbow on his thigh to stabilize the heavy barrel. He closed his eyes, shutting out the stinging smoke. He listened. Thud. The boots shuffled backward on the porch. Grunt. The heavy intake of air as 2 men swung the massive post back. Elias calculated the angle. He visualized their stance, the height of their chests as they leaned into the swing. He aimed dead center at the thickest part of the oak door. He levered the rifle. A fresh cartridge chambered with a sharp clank. He fired. He threw the lever down, ejecting the smoking brass, pulling it back up in a blur of motion. He fired again. He levered. He fired a 3rd time. 3 rapid, deafening cracks. The heavy lead slugs punched cleanly through the dense oak, exiting the exterior side with devastating velocity. A sharp, ragged scream tore through the night, abruptly cut short. The massive fence post hit the porch planks with a hollow, rolling boom, followed by the heavy, lifeless collapse of a body dropping right beside it. Heavy boots scrambled away, retreating off the porch and diving into the sparse cover of the yard. The cabin descended into a suffocating, pressurized silence once more. The smoke was a thick, physical blanket. Then Elias heard it, a faint crushing sound directly above his head. Dry cedar shingles snapping under a heavy, careful tread. Someone had scaled the rear wall during the chaotic gunfire. The footsteps moved toward the center of the roof, stopping directly over the wide stone chimney. Elias lowered the Winchester to the floor. He reached down to his right boot, his fingers wrapping around the bone handle of a long, heavy hunting knife. He drew it free. The blued steel caught a faint flicker of the moonlight bleeding through the gun holes in the door. He stood perfectly still beside the stone hearth, letting the pitch-black shadows completely swallow him, and waited for the ash to fall. A faint cascade of dry gray soot tumbled down the dark throat of the stone chimney. It dusted the cold masonry of the hearth with a soft, barely audible whisper. Elias remained completely motionless, his broad back pressed flat against the rough fieldstone. Above him, the heavy, deliberate scrape of a leather boot heel against the chimney stack echoed sharply in the frozen night air. The intruder was positioning himself on the roof's peak. A sharp, sulphurous hiss cut through the quiet. The brief, harsh flare of a struck match threw a weak orange glow down the vertical shaft. The man was lighting a tightly bound bundle of kerosene-soaked rags, intending to drop the makeshift torch into the blind box of the cabin and smoke them out. Elias stepped directly into the open hearth. He looked straight up the dark, narrow tunnel. The man's face appeared at the top, a pale, shadowed mask framed by the faint silver moonlight leaning precariously over the opening to gauge the drop. Elias did not hesitate. He drove his right arm upward, thrusting the heavy hunting knife straight up the dark flue. The 10-inch blued steel blade caught the man perfectly beneath the jawbone. The lit match extinguished instantly, plunging the shaft back into absolute black. A wet, choked gurgle echoed down the stone walls. The man's weight shifted violently. He scraped against the exterior masonry, sliding backward off the steep pitch of the cedar roof. 3 seconds later, a heavy, lifeless impact shook the frozen earth near the cordwood pile. The perimeter dissolved into paralyzing quiet. The remaining deputies were gone, either dead in the freezing dirt or fleeing blindly across the moonlit basin. Only one rhythm remained outside, the heavy, erratic crunch of boots dragging toward the rear of the cabin. Vance. He hit the weakened back door with the full, desperate momentum of his body. The rusted iron hinges shrieked in protest. The splintered oak gave way, blasting inward with a shower of sharp wooden fragments. Vance stumbled into the pitch-black kitchen area. His chest heaved violently, his breathing ragged, drawing in huge, panicked gulps of the cordite-laced air. He swung his silver-handled revolver in a wide, frantic arc, firing blindly into the thick, suffocating shadows. The heavy muzzle flashes strobed the small room in blinding, violent bursts of yellow light. One heavy lead round shattered a stack of ceramic plates on the wooden counter. Another punched cleanly through the cast-iron body of the stove. He fired a third time, the slug burying itself deep into the thick timber wall, mere inches from the canvas cot. The woman beneath the heavy wool blanket let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Vance pivoted toward the fragile sound, thumbing the heavy hammer back for a fourth shot. He never pulled the trigger. Elias moved from the deep shadow of the hearth like a phantom. He did not tackle the deputy. He stepped directly inside the man's guard, his thick left hand striking out with brutal, practiced precision. His calloused fingers clamped entirely over the cylinder and hammer of Vance's revolver, jamming the heavy iron mechanism, rendering it completely useless. Vance let out a feral, panicked grunt. He dropped his weight, throwing a wild, looping punch with his free hand. Elias slipped the desperate strike, bringing the heavy brass pommel of his hunting knife crashing down onto Vance's right wrist. Bone cracked loudly in the dark. The revolver clattered uselessly onto the floorboards. Vance roared an animal sound, completely stripped of his previous arrogant drawl. He lunged forward, driving his shoulder hard into Elias's chest. The sheer, desperate momentum carried them both backward across the room. They hit the heavy oak dining table. The thick wood groaned in protest, then completely buckled under their combined weight. They crashed to the floor in a chaotic, blinding tangle of splintered timber, shattered ironstone, and choking dust. The fight devolved into raw claustrophobic butchery. The darkness stripped away all technique, leaving only the primal mechanics of survival. Vance clawed blindly at Elias's face, his thick fingers slipping on the sweat and grime coating the older man's jaw. He found the collar of Elias's canvas shirt twisting the tough fabric agonizingly tight against the windpipe. Elias did not thrash against the chokehold. He simply shifted his hips, pinning Vance's right leg firmly beneath his own massive weight. He drove his left forearm hard across Vance's throat, pinning the man's head relentlessly against the unyielding floorboards. The deputy thrashed wildly, his iron-shod boot heels drumming a frantic, dying rhythm against the wood. Elias raised his right hand. The hunting knife was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of the table. He formed a heavy, rock-solid fist. He brought it down. The impact was a sickening, wet sound that echoed flatly through the small cabin. He raised his arm and brought it down again. The frantic drumming of the boots stopped entirely. Vance's grip on the shirt collar went slack. His arms fell heavy and useless to his sides, his thick fingers twitching once before settling into the cold dust. Elias remained kneeling over the ruined body for a long minute. He did not move. He let the chaotic burning oxygen fill his lungs in slow, deliberate pulls. The thick, coppery stench of fresh blood completely overpowered the lingering smell of sulfur. The cabin was utterly silent once more, save for the faint, trembling breaths coming from the corner. The eastern horizon bled a raw, bruised purple before giving way to a harsh, blinding crimson. The transition offered no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving illumination of the carnage left behind. The frigid night air clung stubbornly to the basin, freezing the dew onto the crushed sagebrush. Inside the ruined cabin, the heavy cast-iron stove radiated a steady, localized wave of heat, its belly glowing a dull, angry orange. The rich, bitter scent of boiling coffee slowly overpowered the thick, suffocating copper stench of the night's butchery. Elias sat on the edge of the front porch. The heavy oak door lay completely off its iron hinges, resting uselessly against the splintered exterior logs. He held the Colt Peacemaker in his lap, the weapon entirely dismantled. His knuckles were severely swollen, the skin split and crusted with dried dark blood. He worked a small oil-soaked scrap of canvas over the blued steel cylinder. The rhythmic metallic slide of the fabric was precise, methodical. He scrubbed the burnt carbon from the forcing cone his face, an impassive mask carved from weathered stone. 50 yards away near the boundary wire, the buzzards had already begun to gather. They perched heavily on the rusted barbs, their black feathers ruffling in the dry morning draft. They let out harsh, guttural croaks, eyeing the 4 distinct canvas-wrapped shapes laid out side by side in the bed of the deputy's abandoned buckboard wagon. The 2 remaining horses stood hitched to the wooden frame, their heads hanging low, their flanks shivering occasionally in the cold air. Elias did not look at the wagon. He reassembled the Colt, the heavy iron parts snapping together with cold, mechanical finality. He loaded 6 fresh cartridges into the cylinder, closed the loading gate, and slid the weapon back into the leather holster resting against his thigh. He picked up a battered tin cup sitting beside his boot. The black liquid sent a thin, twisting spiral of steam into the freezing air. He took a slow, deliberate swallow. His pale gray eyes tracked the endless, barren expanse of his land. Inside the cabin, the thick wool blanket shifted. The woman opened her good eye. The narrow shafts of morning sunlight pierced the shattered shutters, casting long, sharp beams across the devastation. She saw the splintered remains of the heavy oak dining table. She saw the shattered ceramic plates scattered like broken teeth across the floorboards. And she saw the dark, tacky pools of drying blood staining the wood, leading in a chaotic, dragged smear out the back threshold. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her joints ached with a deep, hollow throb. The heavy canvas cot creaked loudly in the quiet room. She flinched instinctively, bracing for a shout, a heavy footstep, or the metallic click of a rifle hammer. Nothing came. She looked toward the open doorway. Elias sat with his broad back to her, a massive, unmovable silhouette framed completely by the burning red dawn. He did not turn around at the sound of the cot. He did not offer a glance or a single word. He simply sat there, drinking his coffee, guarding the shattered threshold of his desolate kingdom. She pulled the heavy wool tighter around her bruised shoulders. She listened to the faint scrape of his boot heel against the porch planks, and the absolute profound silence stretching across the miles of desert beyond him. The hunters were dead. The violent storm had broken against this immovable rock. She leaned her head back against the rough log wall, closed her eyes, and took her first slow, deep breath in 3 days. The desert always reclaims its own. The blood bakes into the white clay, the wind erases the heavy boot prints, and the profound, suffocating silence settles back over the barren kingdom. Elias broke his long peace, choosing the brutal, familiar weight of his colt to shield a broken stranger from the wolves. But the ash settling in the ruined cabin leaves a heavy question hanging in the cold morning draft. When a man must resurrect the monster inside himself to slaughter the monsters at his door, does that make him a righteous savior or just a more efficient killer? Is absolute ruthlessness, when used to protect the helpless, truly a form of justice or just another inescapable shade of sin? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. If this journey into the unforgiving frontier struck a chord with you, leave a steady like on the video. It helps keep the fire burning. Subscribe to Iron Resolve Tales for more audio dramas, exploring quiet grit, hard choices, and the heavy price of redemption in the West. Until our trails cross again, keep your powder dry and ride steady.